1, go.
Okay, welcome to all of you here in Madrid and in Stockholm and online to this event that is going to look at whether the ambitions of small countries in terms of climate reductions can make a difference and what are indeed the best policies to follow. The presentation we will have today is based on a report from the Nordic Council of Ministers called the Nordic Economic Policy Review, and it looks at the cost effectiveness of Nordic climate policies. Are we getting enough bang for the buck with the things we're doing? And it puts up certain theses about what we could do better maybe. And this will be introduced by Director Kjell Nielsen from Nordregio, which is an international research center for regional development under the Nordic Council of Ministers. And to comment Kjell's presentation, we will have Ms. Gertrud Denks from the Estonian Environment Ministry, Director of Climate. And in Stockholm also, if we can have a look at Jonas and Kjell, we will have Jonas Ferryman with a beard. No, they both have a beard. Jonas to the right, who is the new chairman of an organization called Generation 2030, a youth organization for sustainable development. So without further ado, I would invite you, Kjell, to start your presentation and introduce the first question. We will have 3 questions. And we will have some comments from Jonas and Gertrud and the audience after each of the 3 sections. So, Kjell, thank you very much. If you can enlighten us.
Kjell has a presentation that will now be up on screen if possible.
I can say this is the first time we're trying this. We're trying to provide sort of a better access to the climate negotiations here in Chile. Chile, sorry, that was a long time ago, here in Madrid. And so this is actually our first of many events where we set up a connection between Madrid and Stockholm, where we have the Nordic Climate Hub. And here we have the presentation straight from Stockholm.
Then I'll start. Nordic Economic Policy Review in 2019 focused on how effective are the Nordic countries' climate policies seen from an economic perspective. And it's dealt with in 5 different chapters where I will present actually 3 main conclusions, which are also a kind of a question at the same time. There are 3 principles here. And to start with, for the before going into the first chapter I will present, I would like to quote one of the editors, Professor Lars Calmfors, because he says, from an economic point of view, and now the quote starts, reduced emissions should be achieved at the lowest possible cost. And that's natural from an economist's point of view. And he says it's sufficient for a country to pay for emissions reductions in another country if they can be achieved more cheaply there. What is critical is that global emissions decrease. It doesn't matter to the climate where the reductions occur. So wherever emissions occur, it, so to say, affects everybody on the globe. And that is, then it's natural actually that the economists, then they say that, okay, let's go for getting to as much as CO2 reduction as possible, wherever it can be done. And in one of these chapters in the report by to Swedish economists Björn Kjellén and Bengt Kriström. They have looked at what is called then abatement costs. That means reduction the cost for reduction of 1 kilo CO2, for examples, and also then looked at the emission trading at the same time. Because that, thanks to the emission trading, Nordic countries could, so to say, buy buy emission rights from countries where the cost is much lower, and then instead of doing improving things in our own countries. And that is, of course, a controversial question. That means that we, in that case, should the Nordic countries lower their ambitions, since their amount of the total CO2 emission in the world is pretty small, and instead use money in buying emission rights and reduce emissions in, for example, in this case, there are 2 European systems for this, where you trade emission rights. One is the so-called emissions trading system, ETS. That means there it doesn't matter so much because there it's equal between the countries. But the other one, the so-called effort sharing regulation, which actually is dealing with 60% of the total emissions, that is related to the GDP per capita. And then you could say that, okay, why don't we buy emission rights and reduce emissions in Lithuania? They have only, they will, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on instead. So that is actually the first question here is, should we do what is most efficient from an economic perspective, or should the Nordic countries continue and for high amounts of money, so to say, reduce our own CO2 emissions, which from a global point of view has a much smaller effect?
Do you wish to hear a comment immediately? I think you might have a comment, Jonas.
Well, the good thing about it being a youth activist is you always have a comment. But my comment about this is well, scientifically and economically that makes sense, of course. It's about reducing as much as possible for low costs, not because it's low cost, but because then we can afford to reduce more. But then again, there's this interesting dilemma where we can say we're only responsible for 0.5% of the global emission, I think, in the Nordic is a very marginal amount. But our political influence in the world is much higher than 0.5%. So we could look at ourselves in another country, like, I don't know, for example, Ethiopia or any other sub-Saharan country, which might have the same amount of, or even if not less, of emission counts. But nobody looks at them for guidance or looks at them for solutions because they haven't had the history yet to come up with solutions. But we do. So it's also about, well, it's about us setting a political message and remembering the place we do have at the table in both of the Council of Ministers here in the North, but also in the UN and the EU and everywhere else. So one thing is about the economic value, another thing is about the political value of our role in the world, and I think that also has to be considered. Yeah.
Yeah. One comment to that I could add actually is that at the launch of this Nordic Economic Policy Review, there were 2 former environment ministers present, and they both argued that it's very important from a political point of view that if we lower our ambitions in the Nordic countries, then we, so to say, ruin the credibility of the policy that we are arguing for. So they are saying more or less the same, that it's important to stay with this, to show that you can, so to say, continue and even increase economic growth at the same time as you reduce the CO2 emissions.
You can, but do you want to?
Yeah, that's that's a question for the governments, I would say. If you can, what's the negative consequence of it then?
You mean if you don't continue the curve
The growth.
going up for?
I mean, history has shown that poor economy is not very good for the environment. Has never been, actually. So I think actually it's, but that's a principal question, of course.
Do you want to continue?
Yes, I can continue with the second one. This is not so much different opinions about amongst the economists, and that is about the question of green technology. And this is a chapter written by Mats Griaker and Rolf Golombek, both Norwegian economists. And they also start with this: why have the Nordic countries so high ambitions when it comes to climate policies, even though their direct effect on the global emissions are very limited? And they say there could be two different arguments or reasons for this. And the first is a national self-interest, an economic interest, by promoting green business and developing a new technology. To be a front runner, then you, so to say, open up for the industry to export technology and so on. And the other one is about altruism and moral obligations, that we say that, okay, we have a responsibility, even if the effects are limited, then we should, so to say, yeah, it's a bad thing to pollute, actually. So, but they focus then on the second one, which is about green technology, green industry. And they're all economists, and that is also not so politically controversial as the first one. There they are more or less agree, all of them. So they, but they start first with that you should look at the world view, and also, but primarily, so they are also for the system, that it's better to invest where it has most effect. But then they say, and that is, I think, quite interesting, that maybe you can do much more for the global climate or the global emissions if you develop technology that will be exported to other countries which pollutes very much more. So that's their, so to say, key message from it. And what they say in this case is that this is an area where they think that Nordic cooperation could really do a lot, actually, on joining our forces when it comes to developing new techniques for storing carbon dioxide, as well as wind power and other technologies where the Nordic countries already are in the forefront.
Can I just ask if you can hear us in Stockholm?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, you forgot to give Getrin a chance to talk just before. So can we just go back to the former recommendations so we can have some comments on the first section from Getrin also? Sorry to...
We have just one screen here. That is why we have some, let me see now. This one. How far back do you want us to go?
The question of whether we should invest heavily in the Nordic countries to lower emissions, or whether we should buy emissions elsewhere. It would be interesting. Shell mentioned Lithuania Gudrun is from Estonia, so it would be interesting to get your perspective, Gudrun, on this issue.
Yeah, I totally agree with the economic point of view that we should look into these options also where it's cheaper to achieve reduction of the CO2 emissions, because the point what was made was really correct that regarding to the climate, it doesn't matter in which point of world you are reducing the emissions. It matters regarding to the global context, because the switch has made also in the Paris Agreement. It does not have any more country-based targets. It has global target towards we have to go or achieve. When we are talking the project and cooperation regarding to the, let's say, developed and developing countries, then it was the same system also used in this period regarding emission reductions when we are looking, for example, what was Finland or Estonia, or just name the country doing. Maybe they had some really good projects on some kind of developing country where it was much cheaper to achieve the reduction of the emissions, but they were able also gain some kind of economical benefits from that. Regarding to that, technology was already mentioned here, the economic growth probably, but the main point between the economic and the environmental challenges, I think, is the balance. We have to seek for the balance between economical point, social point, and environmental point. It must be in balance. Otherwise, it's not very well functioning. But find the balance. That's the challenge, the key challenge actually. And I think Nordic countries, maybe, for example, Denmark wouldn't be such a front runner regarding to the green energy and wind farms if maybe they wouldn't have this kind of targets. Or Norwegian, they have really great potentials regarding to the hydropower, and they have used very well that. They have put in the work for them, creating economic growth through that, creating greener jobs. It's all related to each other through different aspects, and we have to take this into account.
So you think the Nordics should stick with their high ambitions, even if they're costly, because they help innovation ahead and they also set a standard?
It depends which kind of maybe regarding to the project, which kind of project you are talking about, or which kind of focus you have. I think if you have great ambitions and great targets, it's a driving force for the country, for a region, for the person. But on the other hand, flexibility to use this kind of system must be also there, because maybe Finland, Estonia, Sweden have lots of forest, but Malta doesn't have. So,
would you welcome the Nordic countries buying emission rights from Estonia?
We are quite struggling with ourselves even. It's a very good example. For example, when we are talking about electricity, Estonia is using our own natural resource. It's called the oil shale. It's not the coal, but we knew it's a little bit different, but it's very, very carbon intense. And as we have connections to our Nordic neighbors, then we are importing actually our fossil energy to other countries. It's the question of the consumption and the production side, because the emissions will stay in Estonia, not in Sweden or Finland.
So you're helping us actually.
Yeah, you can put it that way also.
Sheila, Jonas, just back to you. If you have any comments to Gudrun's remarks before we continue.
Yeah, actually, I think it works quite well to step over to the third question or the third chapter, because it's dealing with Norway and the Norwegian energy policy. Can we have the... Yeah, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Okay. The third question I wanted to raise actually is the question of the efficiency of subsidies. And this was a chapter written by a Norwegian researcher, Katinka Holtzmark from University in Oslo. And she compared actually, or she discussed two things. One is the ambitious climate policy that you have in Norway when it comes to internal consumption and things like that, and took the subsidies to electric cars as an example, which is from an CO2 reduction efficiency point of view an extremely expensive way of reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then she, after concluding that, and you can say that in general these economists are quite critical towards subsidies in general. They like taxes more, to punish those who are doing wrong, so to say, than giving subsidies to good actions. Then she discussed what would be Norway's most important contribution for CO2 reduction, and that is, of course, stop producing oil. And she took the example then that to not exploit the, so to say, the last oil fields that you have identified and so on, where you practically can stop a production. And that would, she then showed in what way it would also diminish. If you take out oil production from one country, then it reduces the total production, because it won't, history had shown that it won't be replaced with 100%. It's maybe replaced with 70 or 80%. So if you take out something, then you can also reduce. This was quite, made a lot of interest from Norwegian media, especially this with the subsidies on electric cars. And it's interesting that the economists prefer the whip before carrots when it comes to these things. I think, once again, that it is questionable, because subsidies, if you take wind power in Denmark, for example, which was mentioned here, it was subsidized for a long time by the state. And then, so I mean, the state go in and then give a certain industry some advantages, and then it becomes compatible in the long run. So I think actually there are quite many examples of good good effect of subsidies.
Michael, over to you.
Yes, Catherine, what can you follow up on that?
Yeah, the taxation and support, or those issues are very, very sensitive regarding to the political point of view. And I think the most important to have, let's say, to the taxation is social acceptance. I think Estonian society compared to the Nordic countries' society is a bit different. And all issues or questions or topics regarding to the taxation, for example, fuels or new cars or old cars, it's very hard to gain the political acceptance there. But anyway, when we were talking about when the report was talking about the subsidies for the electric cars, yes, I understand the dilemma behind of that. Should we force people to use more private cars, or should we force them to move towards public transportation? Yeah. It all depends what kind of solutions you have to offer. When you are trying to force people to use more public transportation, the public transportation must be fast, be green, and it must be suitable for those private persons who are using that. Sometimes it's much easier to use a private car, or faster to use private cars than public transportation. But in Nordic countries, as far as my knowledges go, it's very well developed, the system. But yeah, in the other hand, we have to look at very well how those money and financial flows are going together with the climate targets, or it doesn't matter. Maybe let's say ambient air targets also. We have to look this as a bigger picture and to have good fiscal policy in place. I think it's not the golden key, but maybe the silver key even.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, with the silver key, that we have to think through very well where we are taking away or where we are going to give it additionally some finances or some elements to use for the greater purpose. For example, the dilemma regarding to the electric cars, where it was talked, yes, it's reducing CO2, but this is only one part. The other part is ambient air. Maybe we have problem with the noise. Maybe we have problem with the small particles. Maybe there are some other issues also. So, but in the other hand, you have to be really good to think through, not one step ahead, but 2 steps ahead. So it has the greater benefits.
The holistic approach, yeah. You said that the Nordic countries or people in the Nordic countries can more easily accept taxation or different measures. Jonas, back to you. What do you think about that? You're Danish. Do you agree or?
Well, as a Dane, I always agree with high taxes. I guess it's part of my heritage and blood. But when it comes to this subsidies as a taxes system, I think it's really interesting the argument about the cars. You don't, when you subsidize the electric cars, it's because you want people to not use fossil fueled cars. So by taxing fossil fuel cars, you reach that effect on a higher level, because then people are up to themselves to decide whether or not they buy an electric car, or take the bike, or walk, or take the bus, or whatever they do, swim, I don't know. But when it comes to the energy sector, it's a bit different. You mentioned the subsidies in the windmill sector, or wind energy in Denmark, and that's very true. It's a big thing for us, for the windmills and Vestas and all that. But because the reason why we subsidize, I guess the reason why it was subsidized is because at the energy level, on the energy network, you can't pinpoint where the source of energy is when you are a consumer. You just buy an amount of energy. Later on, we were able to then sort it out, but initially you couldn't choose your source of electricity. You just got power. So when you subsidize a sector so that it can over time become marketable, then it can compete with the fossil fuels markets. So that's a level where if you just taxed the fossil fuel, then energy would be more expensive to the consumer, and they wouldn't know why, or they wouldn't know where the reason behind it would be, and then they'll be against the movement, which we don't want if we want to have a holistic approach. It comes back to a more philosophical. I'm sorry, am I talking too much? Okay. It comes back to a more philosophical approach about choosing your sacrifice. And also comes back to where we talk about in the Nordic region what we can do apart from just reducing our own emissions. It's also about showing the world that we are willing to sacrifice, even though we are rich and we're doing quite well, if we're supposed to say so ourselves, which we are allowed to, I'd say. If we are able to sacrifice our well-being and some of our welfare to do the greater good or to lead an example, it's much easier to tell Poland or Hungary, the EU table down in Brussels that they could do the same with our assistance and guidance. There's a philosopher who said that life is about choosing your suffering, and I know that's a dark prospect, but it's not that far from the truth. And when it comes to the climate crisis, there is a lot of suffering. So we also have to pick our wars. And I know there's this idea that we can profit of it, and I guess we can. But that's a side bonus, and it's also a matter of which effect we will have the most. Would it be the economic one, or would it be the political one? I would say it will always be the political one in our part of the world. Okay, can I ask you then, Kjell? You are not quite as young as Jonas, but youngish enough to be idealistic also, I suppose. This is back to also your first presentation, Kjell. So should we focus on the low-hanging fruits?
should we be idealistic and be first movers? What do you think is?
Yeah, first, I'm not so fond of sacrifice. I believe more in the situation where you can, so to say, develop and prosper, and at the same time be environmentally friendly in all ways, actually. So I believe in combining the two instead of putting them up against each other. When it comes to the question, and now I would like to return then to the final slide. Go back to that. Yeah.
I think it's the next.
Yeah. The first one says that as the cost effectiveness against, so to say, versus the front runner perspective. I think it's both. I think it's both. Of course, and I believe mostly personally actually in the second one, that we, by, so to say, inspiring and putting demands on others, it's also the question, if you have higher ambition yourself, then you can ask others to do their best. But if you slow down your own ambitions, then it's hard to require from the others that they should sacrifice or reduce their emissions. So that is. And then, of course, the second one, which we agree, and from a moral point of view is, of course, important, is that we still have high CO2 emissions per capita. And then the question about the technology and the economic part of that and the potential that lies in developing this industry. I remember when Danish wind industry started, actually, and it was a combination. And I remember during the period when Svend Auken was environment minister in Denmark, he wanted to encourage the wind industry. So there was a political will behind it. We want this. It's environmental friendly, and we have quite a lot of energy resources in Denmark. So there was a consciousness actually of these things, both from a business point of view as well as from an environmental.
So in your opinion, what should the Nordic countries do to get the best bang for the buck?
Yeah, as I said first, that it's a combination. I think it's complicated. Then it's my personal view. I can, of course, understand what these economists have. They recommend a more strategic use of the emission trading. And there are a Swedish paper mill in Domsjö. They earn hundreds of millions of, Swedish kronor, but anyway, every year, actually, by selling their emission rights, permits. Sweden is the only country in the EU, plus Norway and Iceland, I think, are in the ETS system that goes with a plus. So we deliver more. So in that case, these industries, they earn money on using renewable energy in a very profitable way, actually.
Can you expand on that? How do they? It sounds like almost a trick, but what is the trick?
Every sector, if you are a paper mill, you get a certain amount of emission rights. You get, and 40% of the emission rights you get for free. They doesn't cost you anything. The other 60% you have to buy. But if you are so efficient, so you are down on 5% or 2%, then you can sell 38% on the market, on a trade market or a kind of a stock market in Amsterdam and London. And then you get money. That's a price on them. One problem with this system that is discussed in another chapter in the book, which I didn't mention, and that is actually that the emission rights are quite cheap. So, and there has been a surplus of emission rights. Now EU is trying to reduce that. So it means that you can buy them too cheap. So there are economic instruments in this that can be used more strategically and more efficiently.
I think
don't
yes.
agree.
Exactly. Jonas needs to.
Okay.
Well, everything you say is factually true, but the thing is, that I fear is now with Sweden having a surplus and they can sell off their emission rights. Yeah. And they sell it, for example, to Poland, who are already not that ambitious when it comes to the emission reduction. How can we make Poland reduce more when we also give them a surplus of emissions? Here's some free tickets so you can pollute more. Also remember the Paris Agreement. See you next year on the black market, right? I mean, what kind of message are we sending then? So it's, I don't know, this is of course not anything that you can do anything about, but isn't it more about go back to the EU and say, well, now we have a surplus, can we use that as more funding for technological advances, or can we do a national tax deduction because of that, or something that just put our emission to another country, because Sweden can say, well, we're emitting less than anywhere else, and of course there's a big advantage and it's an achievement in itself, but moving our emission and our footprint to another country is not really being, that energy efficient or emission efficient, is it? Isn't it just kind of out of sight, out of mind? This is my issue and my suspicion.
Gudrun, maybe you have a comment to add to this. First of all, what do you think of this issue?
As Kiel mentioned right at the beginning, there is two trading systems currently in Europe, meant for countries, and another is meant for the industry, meaning heavy industry, energy. The main principle is the same, polluter pays. And for example, let's say I'm the private company, I produce electricity or heat, it doesn't matter. There are their own technicalities and details, but the main aim is that, for example, if I receive 2 units free of charge, those quotas, and my actual emissions were 10 units, then I have to buy from that market those missing 8 units. And what was actually the good point is that the units or quotas price were quite low, quite long time, but it has been raising since 2018 beginning. And currently the price is around 25 euros per ton on the energy and the heavy industry sector, meaning to the private sector. That's the price. What's the price on the country-based system? We don't know, because this market is, let's say, so-called closed market, because partners between, when they are making transition, for example, if Estonia sells their quotas to Finland or Finland to Sweden, then this is secret information. And if they don't wanna publish how much money they earned or they needed to give away, then it's their private business. But the industrial side is where installations are trading. This is open market, and you are buying from these auctions or platforms, auction platforms, those units. This is actually this fiscal measures what I was mentioned also. When the quota price is high enough, then this is the incentive for the industry and the sector, the private sector, to think through their action plans, their business plans. Is it much more cheaper for me to invest the cleaner technologies, to the circular economy, to resource efficiency, etc., just name it, because the money is talking, and the money is the driving force for the private sector, to the investors, and of course for the countries. For example, and also I like the point what was made regarding to the political influence. This is a risk, because policies are changing time to time, maybe 5 years, maybe after 4 years, the priorities might be different. But if you have a clear goal and target where you would like to go as a country, as a whole region, or maybe even, let's say, European Union, then it gives a very clear signal to the private sector and also to the public sector. For example, good example based on Estonia. Estonia is a small country, but maybe you have heard about the movement Let's Do It, cleaning up day area. This was started in Estonia. Small country, but dream big. You can achieve things that you would like to do. And this is a huge movement right now. So I see that even if you're a small country, your contribution can be a huge, maybe not right away, but maybe after 2 days, maybe after 2 years, maybe after 2 decades, but it has its own influence. And back to Estonia, for example, when we calculated this year, or we had actually a study, can Estonia be climate neutral and how much it costs us? We found out that the sum of this transition should or could be around 17 billion euros, but the main part of these investments will be on the private sector. Let's say it was approximately 4 billion euros of investments for the public sector. So we have to much more work together with the different parties and different stakeholders regarding to the targets what they are trying to reach. We have to much more include private sector money to make them understand also where we are going, but they need to have clear signals.
They need the incentives. So it's the stick or the carrot that Shell also mentioned earlier.
It's the both sides.
It's the mix.
Yeah, and it's the mix. I totally agree. It is the mix. It's not wise to have eggs on one basket.
No. So what you're saying is also that this is so much about cooperation. It's about co-organizing. No one can do this alone.
Yeah, totally.
We actually have to work also across borders. Yeah. So just briefly before we go back to Stockholm, what do you think how would the Nordic countries get the biggest bang for their buck in their climate investments?
I think the regional cooperation, when we have the common goals and we have this understanding that nobody should be left behind, we have to have a closer cooperation regarding our targets. Is it climate? Is it water? Is it forest? It doesn't matter because everything is related to each other, and the final outcome is quite often affected maybe small risks or small things, developers and small details.
Yes. Shell, Jonas, do you have any famous last words before we ask the audience if there are questions?
Yeah, I want to say a few things. I'll do it briefly. About this Let's Do It initiative from Estonia, it's really good. I've read about it, and I'm a big fan. And I was saying about even if it's a small country, you can have a large impact. And I want to say, even the smallest things can have a change, the biggest change, of course, in the world. And if you're wondering where that quote is from, it's from Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. And now we are talking about fantasy. I want to go back to the world of Narnia, where you mentioned that we can have economic growth and also have reduction in CO2 at the same time. I think I answered a question from the lady sitting right there yesterday about the win-win situation about reducing what you're talking about. And I said then, and I said it now, it's not possible. We can earn like 0.5% increase in GDP and lower our emissions a bit, but that's not the goal we have. That's not the agreement we have with the rest of the EU countries and the rest of the world, apart from the US, apparently. So it's about, so what is it that we're going to do? Are we going to have the agreement, and are we going to remind ourselves that that will come with some costs, some personal costs, some goods? Or are we going to maybe focus on how we can circumnavigate it a bit and then make some green movements and also increase our GDP to the same level that we had before? I'm not saying that we should go back in a recession, like a voluntary recession. That's not it. It's more about how much are we willing to sacrifice. And I think we have to accept that it's actually quite a bit if we have to meet our targets. Yeah.
Shell, do you have anything to say to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, no, I'm in a general sense quite optimistic also with this. If we have looked at other, so to say, threats, environmental threats, there has been quite a lot of advanced during the years. So I'm older than you, so I experienced the environmental crisis in the 70s, for example. And there we have actually achieved a lot when it comes to water and air pollution, and I think it's possible also when it comes to CO2 emissions. Then, of course, being a human means that you consume something that, of course, it's right that, but when you say that, then you should stop, have children and things like that. I think that is that is the utter consequence, and I don't want to buy that consequence. I want to see future generations, and I think there is a limit also when it comes to the size of the population, which is not too far away. That then we can, so to say, stop that factor that is causing more emissions.
Mikael, before you continue, I just want to say that even though we are not having such a huge audience here in Stockholm, I don't know how many you are in Madrid, but we have at the moment 2,300 people watching us on the internet. So think about what you say now, because many people hear you.
Yeah. So do you have you don't have questions in Stockholm?
Hi, thank you so much. Very interesting, and I'm glad that you've been mentioning a bit about the technology and how Sweden can contribute there, and also the regional cooperation we can do here in the Nordic countries. But I just want to stress that, as was mentioned in one small point in the presentation, that we do have in Sweden a very high emission rate per capita, and this needs to be stressed. And it's not about us telling other people or other countries in, for example, Africa. There was Ethiopia, I think, mentioned that we should take the lead in Sweden because we are better and we're more advanced, but it's more that we actually have the possibility to sacrifice something in our way of living. You can't really compare us in Sweden and the Nordic countries with people living in African countries and Asian countries who are just barely surviving. So I think this is a bit forgotten in the discussion we've had today. And we must remember that many people don't have the privileges that we do have here. I just want that to be remembered. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Do we have any questions here in Madrid? We do have, like here, remember you have 2,300 people watching, so.
My name is Mårten Björk. I'm a Swedish entrepreneur working with companies like Elpanneteknik Sweden, Ecobarge Sweden, etc. I'm working within thermal energy storage. Now, one thing is clear that also that the report mentions is the benefit of having subsidized pilot plants, you can say, in the Nordic countries to develop the technologies. But we are speaking very less about the business modeling, innovation within business modeling to bring the technologies abroad where we can really make a difference. So one thing that I would like to listen to you, for instance, from my side, I currently supply 2,500 megawatts of thermal energy storage, replacing coal-fired district heating in China to reduce air pollution, balancing renewables to the grid, and utilizing difference peak value period electricity pricing. Now, to do that, I have to cooperate with Chinese investors and now go abroad with Chinese investments based on one road, one belt, as there are not currently business models supported from Scandinavian countries. Now, we don't need the subsidies, but we need to make the end users bankable. Now, through the One Road, One Belt, the Chinese now provide opportunities to make the end users bankable, and then we have plenty of finance investors worldwide very interested in supporting this type of technologies. What we also do, for instance, from Ecobarge, desalination of water, wastewater treatment, etc. So I would like to have your comments on why it's not so focused on the business modeling in reports like this. You say that the technologies can make a difference, but if you don't make a difference in terms of business modeling, making it also financially sustainable, it's quite pointless to me. So I would like to have your comments on why that is not more reflected in reports like that.
So you're also addressing the issue of whether we should, in the Nordics, for instance, invest more in clean tech and and in climate solutions, also to be used abroad?
Well, first of all, I would say that we focus with an industry involved in making pilot plants where the Scandinavian governments are the customers. So we actually therefore make the pilot plants in Scandinavia. Now, Sweden is the equivalent of a normal medium-sized Asian city. If we really want to sell the products, we should make the pilot plants in the countries where they're really needed and provide guarantees, export guarantees for end users, maybe governments in developing countries, so that we can use private funding and create innovation platforms. EcoBarge Sweden is a typical such example, where we now do floating PV, we do energy storage, we do desalination and wastewater treatment, and also thermal energy storage. So we have the solution, but we need to rely on Chinese money. Why not? We want our people in Sweden and Denmark to make money. I mean, now I contribute to exporting Chinese wind power instead of Danish, right?
Well, Katrin, you mentioned the importance of the bid. We can maybe take a comment from Katrin before we go back to Stockholm.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the importance of the private sector, that it makes up actually the largest part of what you need to focus on.
Yeah, I really like your comment. Thank you very much for that. What has Estonia done so far regarding to this cooperation regarding private money and public money? We have launched a call especially for that purpose, meaning that we are seeking Estonian green tech companies, and they are going to be as a, let's say, part of the tender, and then they can we support them also with our money, and they can export their green technology to needed developing countries. We have special criteria for that, etc. And every year, that amount of money is maybe on the Nordic scales not so big. It's 1 million euros per year. But last year was the first round of the call. This year, the second round of the call is going on currently, and all Estonian, let's say, local governments and NGOs, private companies, whoever wants, can participate. And that's the reason how we, by baby steps, but still, we are already thinking on that issue or topic. But next year, we are planning to look more and more widely on the government level, or maybe and we are working on I don't know, I think probably it's the correct name is environmental fund, and the main aim of that is also to try to put private and public money more working together.
Well, then I think we go back to Stockholm for a few final comments. We're almost at the end of our transmission here. So public-private partnerships, is that the way forward?
Yes, it is, in a way, because actually in the following on this report, I know that Anders Hedberg, who is responsible for this at Nordic Council of Ministers Secretariat, he has taken contact with Nordic Investment Fund to see if this is possible to continue with focusing on business models and establishing loans. So it's actually in the pipeline in the Nordic cooperation.
Very shortly on the case of business models specifically, as you mentioned, business models is a normative term where you adapt the description of the market to make your business the most competitive. So it's not like a business model is something you just look up and there's the business model. It changes comparing to what business you run and what your purpose is and how modern and progressive you are. But it adapts to the market structures. And market structures adapt both to the market within itself intrinsically, but also extrinsically to the people in power through legislation and politics. So again, we can talk about business on a small scale or a big scale, and it somehow ends up on a political level again. Just think that has to be reminded with those steps. Yeah.
And that's also why we are here, of course, at COP25 in Madrid. It's a negotiation process. It's a political process. And I think we tried to throw some light on this. This almost turned into a 101 on climate economics. a little over my head, I have to admit, but I think we learned a lot from this. Actually, if you look at the figure next to Shell, it's a so-called climate superhero that we have made a campaign about in connection to COP25. And I think that if we can all learn to master all the topics we discussed today, we would all be climate superheroes, in fact. So that is something to aim for. Mary, do you have any final words from Stockholm before we close down?
Actually, no. I'm just very glad about having so many people all over the world hearing what you're talking about. That's very nice. And thank you.
Thank you, and stay tuned for more transmissions. You can find more on norden.org, the website of the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we are on for the whole show until the 13th of December.
And our next show will be at 6 o'clock.
Okay.